Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House taking a look at some of the guns that they are going to be selling in their upcoming June of 2017 regional auction. And today we're going to take a look at a Steyr Scout rifle. Now, this rifle is the final manifestation of a concept that was really promoted by a guy named Colonel Jeff Cooper. Now, Cooper's name ought to be familiar to serious shooters. He is basically the father of modern combative pistol shooting. He was also a very serious hunter, worldwide hunter, Africa, North America, everywhere, and an all-around gun guy in every sense of the word. And starting in 1985, he really started promoting this concept of what he called a scout rifle. And the idea was it was a rifle that was meant to be fast, accurate, handy, lightweight, rugged, and versatile. It was supposed to accomplish or meet the needs of someone who is traveling alone in the wilderness and might need to shoot anything from small game to dangerous game. Now, this is really optimized more for animals than for humans. To continue on some of what Cooper came up with as the criteria for a proper scout rifle, by his definition. And again, this is a concept that he is creating and defining. He wanted the rifle to be no more than 1 meter in length. He wanted it to weigh no more than 3 kilograms. That would be 6.6 pounds. And this is because this is a rifle that gets carried a lot and shot occasionally. And so its handiness is actually a really important criteria to it. In terms of practical effectiveness, his criteria was that it needed to be able to take down a 200 kilogram animal, so about 450 pounds. It needed to be able to do that basically to any range within the skill of the shooter. And that's kind of interpreted as 300 to 400 yards or meters. Now, Cooper began by experimenting with a lot of different existing actions to try and come up with an ideal manifestation of this rifle. And ultimately, in the early 90s, he actually was able to convince the management at Steyr Mannlicher that this was an interesting project that could have commercial legs, and Steyr decided to build a rifle to his scout rifle specifications. And this is the result, unveiled in 1997 or early 98. They're still on the market today. They're still available. And the tricky part about this is that I think properly understanding the purpose and the concept behind it. So most of the rifle purchases that are made today, at least in the United States, are for recreation or competition or self-defense. And in that case, I mean self-defense against people. And none of those things is really what the Steyr Scout is designed for. The Steyr Scout, or in fact the Scout concept, I would say has much more in common with something like this, a Winchester Model 94 in .30-30. This was a quintessential frontiersman's rifle. You could shoot pretty much anything with it effectively. You had a substantial capacity of ammunition. It was a repeating rifle, quick follow-up shots, sights that were appropriate could be used at close range, could also be used at longer range, a cartridge that was effective enough to take down pretty much anything you were going to run into. Is it a buffalo rifle? No. If you had to shoot a buffalo because that was the only food available, could you with a 94? Yeah, absolutely, you could. The Steyr Scout is that concept but modernized, and I think it owes a lot to Cooper's hunting experiences in Africa. And for these reasons, it's not something that makes necessarily a lot of sense for the typical American gun buyer who isn't really an avid hunter. Certainly not as much as was the case 50 or 100 years ago in the United States. So the foundation of this rifle is the Steyr SBS bolt action system. It's a rotating bolt, manually operated rifle. Now, a couple things that are useful for this specific system are the bolt head locks into the barrel extension, meaning that there is never any pressure on the receiver, similar to an AR-15 in that particular way. That allowed Steyr to use an aluminum receiver on the Scout, which helped reduce its weight substantially. The furniture is pretty much all Zytel or polymer, which also helps reduce weight. It has a lightweight profile 19-inch barrel. The end here is fluted, specifically to continue reducing weight. Weight was a big element on these rifles. It's one of those things where you have to pay attention to it at every opportunity, or else you won't make a weight goal. Grains make ounces and ounces make pounds, and if you don't pay attention to the ounces, you'll end up with way too many pounds on the rifle. One of Cooper's requirements for the concept was to be able to reload rapidly if necessary, and that gets interpreted as being either detachable magazines or stripper clips. The Steyr Scout does not accept stripper clips, but it does have quick detach magazines, 5-round mags, and there is one in the rifle, and then there is actually also one in storage in the buttstock. So you have 2 mags on the rifle at all times, which is pretty cool. One of the other features of the Steyr Scout that I find fascinating, I think this is just really cool because it really harkens back to some of the guns that I look at more often, is that this actually has a magazine disconnect. If you look closely at the magazine catch, you'll see that there are 2 hooks on all of the catches. That is so that you can actually put the magazine in at this position where it's still protruding slightly out of the receiver. And at this point, the bolt will not pick up a cartridge from the magazine, which means you can keep a loaded magazine in reserve and single load cartridges through the ejection port to shoot. When you decide that you need the magazine, all you have to do is push it the rest of the way in. You don't have to use the locking catches at all because those tabs are angled. From this position, it's just a little bit of force, and then you have 5 rounds available for rapid fire shooting. I mean, that just harkens straight back to rifles of 100 years ago or more. The early bolt-action repeating rifles were all set up with magazine disconnects for exactly this same reason. And I find it fascinating that Cooper and Steyr decided to bring that feature back on this rifle. One of the other features of the Steyr Scout is an integral bipod that folds up into the stock. On the Scout rifle concept in general, as purported by Cooper, this was kind of a luxury item because it was basically impossible to add a bipod to an existing rifle system without way exceeding the weight limit. But by making this from scratch, Steyr was able to do that. So to deploy the bipod, you have a button here, push that in, and then you have 2 thin bipod legs. These are all polymer, and they fold out like so. They are wobbly. Well, they have pivot here, but the legs themselves have some flex. They are widely criticized as being far too flimsy. But I think this is one of those instances where people are attempting to judge a sporting rifle or an outdoorsman's rifle by military standards. This isn't something that is going to, this wouldn't live up to a military, severe trial, but it's not intended to. This is a utilitarian bipod. It folds up completely out of the way. It weighs basically nothing, and it's there if you need it for an extra long shot. Something I do want to point out on this, because I think people who have these rifles or who are considering these rifles will be curious about it. There is no locking catch. It's just held open by a spring detent. So to close this, you do just grab it and pull, and it makes a really nerve-wracking snap when you do that. But that is, in fact, the proper way to close the bipod. So don't worry about it. That's how it's supposed to be. There is also, by the way, a rail under here if you wanted to put on a bipod or if you wanted to put on a shooting sling attachment of some sort, you can do that on that rail. All right, and one of the other really iconic elements to the Steyr Scout is the use of a long eye relief scope. This is a Leupold M8. It's a 2.5 power magnified optic that has this long eye relief. So a standard cheek weld on the rifle back here gives you proper eye relief to use this scope. And there's been a lot of, the casual viewer will look at the Scout rifle and the only thing that they'll take away from it is, it uses a long eye relief scope. Therefore, anything that I stick a long eye relief scope on becomes a Scout rifle. And that's not really the case. And there are some specific reasons to use a scope like this. And some of them are obvious and some are a little less obvious. So the concept called for a low power magnified optic because you wanted to retain a wide field of view and you wanted to retain peripheral vision. And this, I think, is one of those elements that is really based on Cooper's African experience. If you're hunting, if you're tracking something or stalking something through brush, you don't want to have your eye focused right up on a magnified optic to the detriment of your peripheral vision. You want to know if you go around the corner of a bush and there's some large angry animal right there that's going to jump on you. And that's one of the places where the long eye relief optic is particularly good, because you can shoot this legitimately, despite the fact that it's magnified, with both eyes open, and you can really actually remain aware of what's going on around you. The placement of the optic is also ideal for stripper clips, which was important to Cooper's concept, although not specifically to the Steyr Mannlicher interpretation of it. This rifle does not use stripper clips. But if you were building a scout rifle type of gun on a military platform that did use clips, having a scope mounted over the action prevents you from using stripper clips, and a long eye relief scope does not. And then one of the most subtle rationales behind this, I think, is that the balance point of the rifle is here at the action. And with a long eye relief scope, you can grab and carry this right at the balance point without interference from the scope. And I think that was something that Cooper placed a lot more emphasis on than a lot of the people who are assessing the rifle today from the outside. So all of those things put together are why they went with the long eye relief. You will note that when Steyr built this rifle, they did include a Picatinny section, very small one, but enough for a scope ring back here behind the action. So that if you get one of these rifles and decide you want a traditional scope, you can mount a traditional scope instead of a long eye relief one. Now, a couple of the more mundane features of the rifle, of course, it has a good trigger. You would expect that from a $2,600, which, by the way, was the retail package price of the gun. The original triggers apparently were like 2.5 to 3 pounds. The production ones tended to be apparently 3.5 to 4, but it's a really nice, crisp trigger. Far better than you would get building a scout rifle from a military surplus action. The butt pad has 2 removable spacers in it, so you can use one or both or none and change the length of pull to whatever you prefer. The safety for Steyr's SBS design is it's a 3-position system. The red dot means it's ready to fire. You can roll this back to the white dot. The white dot is safe, but the bolt can be operated. So this allows you to put the rifle on safe and then manipulate a cartridge in the chamber without it firing. Or you can roll it all the way back and this tab pops up. That completely locks the rifle. So the trigger is disconnected and the bolt is locked in position. And in order to take it out of this safe position, you have to actually depress that button and then roll the safety forward. And lastly, the sling swivel attachments are removable and they are mounted on both sides of the rifle. So to take this sling loop off, you just push it in and rotate 90 degrees and it comes out like this. And then you can either put it in a drawer if you don't want to use all 3 of them on the rifle at once and thus be guaranteed to lose it, or mount it back on the gun. Now, the astute viewer will have noticed that there are 3 sling swivels on this rifle, and that's because this scout rifle package included a Ching sling, and I'll tell you what, this is getting long, so we will address the Ching sling in a separate video all by itself so that we can give it the appropriate detail that it deserves. So despite the interest in and the prevalence of long eye relief scopes, Cooper did not consider an optical sight to actually be a necessary component of the scout rifle concept. Iron sights would work. His preference was definitely for ghost ring, aperture type iron sights. And Steyr, in fact, has integrated backup iron sights onto this rifle. So there is a little folding aperture rear sight back here. Cartridge tip would be the ideal tool to use to raise that. That's it. It is not windage adjustable, but there is a little tiny screw right there, and you can actually zero this for elevation, which is a good thing. And then there is a folding front sight to match. However, the optic on this particular rifle is slightly longer than the front sight. So normally you would press this, and the front sight pops up here. In this case, it's being held down by the scope. So as long as the scope's on there, of course, you don't really need backup iron sights. I continue to find the scout rifle to be a really interesting concept, and I really like Steyr's interpretation of it. One of the big problems, of course, is finding a set of circumstances, a venue in which to actually use it in the role it was intended to be used, short of buying a plane ticket to Africa or inventing a time machine that will take me back 100 years. I'll tell you what, 100 years ago on the Western frontier, this would have been a pretty darn compelling rifle. Would have been crazy looking, but functionally very compelling. And that's a situation we just don't really have here in the United States anymore. But there are people who do go hunting general purpose in Africa. There are people who live in areas that are legitimately still frontier-like. Rural Alaska is an excellent example, probably one of not very many excellent examples, but there are places in the Mountain West and in Alaska where something like this, I think, still definitely does have very practical application. So if you're interested in this one, it is actually a kind of unusual example in that it is chambered for the 7mm 08 cartridge, which was not offered commercially in the US. This was a European edition of the rifle for those countries where military cartridges, like the 7.62 NATO, were not allowed to be owned by civilians. So Steyr did release it in Europe in 708, and one of those has ended up here in the United States, and that's what this one is. If you take a look in the description below, you'll find a link to Rock Island's catalog page on this one, so you can take a look at their description and pictures and price estimate, and if it's something you'd like to add to your own collection, you can place a bid over the phone or through their website, and good luck. Thanks for watching.